Donnybrook is made possible by the members of 9PBS.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another edition of Donnybrook. Pretty cold outside. Hope you're warm and cozy inside or wherever you are, because we have quite a few topics coming your way. And we welcome later in the program what we call Donnybrook Next Up, Jeff Smith from the Missouri Workforce Housing Association, trying to increase affordable housing. And he's also working to improve the conditions at the county jail. So we'll talk to him about that. Let's meet the panelists who are joining us for this edition on 9PBS. We welcome the news director for the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese, also co-host of Jennifer and Wendy on 550. He's Mr. Bill McClellan, our Tom Brady here at Donnybrook. Of course, he's with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And we have Ray Hartmann, one of our founders from the Big 550 KTRS, as well as rawstory.com and the Riverfront Times. And we welcome Mr. Alvin Reid from the St. Louis American, along with 590 AM and 97.1 FM. Alvin, we're going to start with you because it's not every day that you see inmates at any correctional facility puncture the exterior wall and basically wave to bystanders as they set fire to bedding material, and they hold up signs, they throw things that are on fire out the fourth floor. And if you drive by Tucker today, you'll see the city jail in downtown St. Louis, which has the scar marks from a fire, and then the side of the building is all boarded up there. Really unusual, but it was a third disturbance, this time a riot over the weekend where inmates were able to jimmy the locks and get out of their cells and then get to a control panel and then open up the cells of others. And that's what we call in correctional circles not a good thing. What do you make of this?
Well, to be light on a very serious story, I mean, it's like hanging the keys next to the jail for Otis the drunk to get out, in Mayberry when he sobers up. The locks have to work, first of all. Two, it's just to the point now where every image of St. Louis and Missouri, I mean, if you're going to make a commercials on why not to relocate here, how about that jail situation and, what's going on throughout the state? And it's just, I just don't understand why we can't get the simplest of things right. And then it causes these magnificent problems. I think we're unique that way. And, I don't know what the answer is, but somebody's got to do something and fast. And it just seems like there's nobody that wants to take responsibility for anything in St. Louis, let alone that jail.
Well, the crazy thing to me is there's the big debate about corrections right now is closing the workhouse. And yet here's the Justice Center, the new show place, that the locks don't work. Jimmy Edwards said, well, the workhouse is more secure and people want to get out of the Justice Center. If the workhouse is superior, why are we closing the workhouse to keep the Justice Center open where the locks don't even work? I mean,
well, I don't think the workhouse is superior. And I think they're unrelated. I mean, I think the workhouse is pretty well known as arguably the worst, at least up till now, the worst jail in the state of Missouri. And what the two issues have in common is we need to incarcerate a certain number of people, but we don't need to incarcerate people for months or maybe more than a year without even giving them a preliminary hearing. They're essentially sentenced before they even get a hearing, and we don't need to have them getting COVID-19. And so there's some real issues here that
I'm not arguing
that this wasn't related to COVID, Ray.
What?
I thought this wasn't related to COVID.
That's not what the prisoners are saying. I mean, the inmates are saying, but that's...
Well, I don't know. That's an interesting point, because when they went to the window, they held up 4 or 5 signs, and none of them said PPE. And some people are saying it's over COVID-19, but that's really why Well, for example, the Art City Defenders, as well as the ACLU, and to be honest, yours truly, have asked to get inside there to look around and ask some questions, because right now, I'll be honest with you, I got some emails and texts from people who work there, as well as people who have family there. And one guy said it's a modern day gulag, but his family member is afraid to speak out because the trial's upcoming and they're afraid that the correction system will work against him if he says anything. So I think outsiders have to go in there and see what's going on.
I mean, I would agree, but also when you have a situation like that, just any kind of jail fracas, prison riot, anything like that, the first thing is you have to determine, how did this happen? And how do we stop it from happening again? I feel bad for anybody in jail who's, even if, they're justifiably there, and I'm talking about murderers and all that. At the same time, you have to keep them in the jail. You have to keep them in their cell. I mean, that's what I mean, we can talk about all the sociological and financial and all that, but if you fail at that, then you have riots. And that's what you can't have.
Well, Charlie, didn't you take a tour of the workhouse?
I did. I did take a tour of the workhouse, but not the city jail.
I understand that, but you said you didn't really see what was being reported, correct?
Well, what was reported is that there was mold all over the place. There were extreme temperatures, and the place smelled, and there was, all sorts of trash and rubbish, and it was not kept up. That I did not see. I didn't see
I don't think you're going to see anything my point is, I don't think you're going to see anything at the Justice Center either if you take a tour.
Well,
a guided tour.
Who knows? If you talk to people who are there, and that's you have to have access to individuals and find out what they're saying. And there's either mold or there's a smell or there's not. I mean, people are saying that there's feces smeared against the doors, that there's urine on the floor, that it's too cold in the wintertime, that the food is horrendous. And so I want to see. I want to take a look at the food.
I think I commend you for doing that, but I also think that the role that's the most important for whether it's Matthew Mahaffey, the public defender who I had on this week, or the ACLU or others, is to have a seat at the table. Lyda Christian appointed this task force. I don't know if you're talking about, but yeah. I don't think it's appropriate for First of all, I don't think it makes sense. I think a lot of this is common sense, but to the extent you're going to be bringing people in to deal with something that's urgent in the next 2 months, some of those people need to be in the room figuring out what to do.
Well,
we don't need the new mayor, whoever he or she is, shouldn't be inheriting somebody else's task force on this. If they want to do a task force going forward, I guess that's fine.
But certainly for the locks and the food, that should be investigated immediately.
But that's common sense stuff. I mean, these people, everybody's on the panel saying, you kind of start with locks that work on a cell when you have a prison.
Well, let's talk about the panel that the mayor did assemble. And I applaud a panel to look into it because outside eyes have to do it. And she originally got Mike Wolf, the former dean of the SLU Law School, and then, of course, he was a justice on the Missouri Supreme Court. He has since stepped aside. But she has Adolphus Pruitt of the NAACP, former state senator Jamila Nasheed, 2 aldermen, Joe Vaccaro, Jeffrey Boyd, Dr. Pamela Walker, public health executive, Charles Norris from the St. James AME Church, Brad Hompey, out of Wisconsin, the only guy out of state. He's a criminal justice expert. And then the Reverend Darrell Gray, civil rights activist. All great people, but Bill McClellan, I think they're too connected, and especially the politicians who are vulnerable to political opinion, public opinion. I think that they need some outsiders who are completely independent with no dog in the hunt, no axe to grind, and they should be looking at it. What do you think, Bill?
Well, I disagree with you on that, Charlie. I think if you're going to have a task force, I like the idea of it's local people and accountable. And the people you mentioned, Nasheed and Gray, are good people, and I trust them. But I tend to agree with Ray that, first of all, we're going to have a new mayor, and I don't think that mayor should be constrained by an old panel. But mostly, like Ray said, this is common sense. This is like the 9/11 stuff. Do you really need a panel to determine that 9/11 calls should have priority over non-emergency? No, that's common sense. Do we need a panel to say that the cells should lock? No, I mean, that's why they're locked up. And so I think for as far as the conditions go, I agree with everybody else that you don't really learn about conditions at jail from having a guided tour. You learn from, like you're doing, talking to people who've been in there, talking to people who work there. And I think that's all better, really, than a panel.
But Bill, those individuals, too, have their say. You work there, you're incarcerated there, but you've got an extra grind as well. Sure. So a guy who works there is going to say it's really good. The guy who's incarcerated, who might be up on charges, is saying, hey, it's the worst place. It's really hard. You have to go in there. Whatever group this is, they have to be inside. And you can't just rely on anybody. You can't rely on the Art City Defenders or the public safety director. You have to be inside and take a look at it.
But Judge Jimmy Edwards said himself that these were serious offenders. You're not talking about accused offenders. You're not talking about parking tickets here. And if human waste is being, smeared on the wall or wherever, the people doing that from inside should be disciplined. And if you don't like the food, go ahead.
If true, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If true. If you don't like the food, try not to commit a crime. I mean, that's something we never hear when we talk about criminal justice reform. I know that sounds simplistic, but it's not the Hilton. The food, you're not. And when Alvin was talking about people from out of state judging St. Louis based on the jails, I would respectfully disagree. I don't think there's a lot of attention paid to jail conditions when people are making decisions to relocate. I just don't. I'm sure you're right.
No. I said, I agree with you. What the hell was I talking about? Sometimes you get your mind changed. They're like, okay, there's other things. But I wanted to say about Judge Wolf, brilliant man, especially because he was on our show. 2 days later, he had this epiphany that, something happened. Something changed his mind. I could see somebody walked in that room and the first words out of their mouth said, it's Tashara Jones' fault, and then he just said, this is ridiculous. So, something happened to make him back away from the responsibility.
Well,
that's what I think.
Charlie, I want to respond a little to Wendy. It's one thing. I don't think anyone, even the most reform-minded, person on this subject, thinks that a jail needs to be the Hilton. I think the question is, it also doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be
Guantanamo. I get that. I don't want them to be waterboarded. But if the inmates, as accused, don't stop smearing bad things on the walls, that's not a problem.
But Ray is right. The conditions should be decent. That's number one. Number
we can't
two,
have inhumane conditions.
Ray,
I agree.
Ray, here's the big issue right now. During COVID, some of these people have been in there for years, and neither the city jail nor the county jail has any sunlight. There's no outdoor recreation area. So one guy is in the county jail, going to the county for a minute. He's been in there 5 years. That means he hasn't had sunlight in 5 years. That's ridiculous. What happened to Gumbo Flats? That would have been better.
Well, walked into the river. I agree, but we need another one.
Okay. I don't have a theory about why Mike decided to get off this thing, but you mentioned Alvin. You name checked Mike, and one of Mike's favorite lines on this subject to what Charlie's saying is, 99% of our inmates are coming out sometime. How do you want them? And it goes to what Charlie's saying. Is how do you want them? You want to effectively torture people in jails because we want to be tough on crime?
That's not fair.
That's not. Fair. But wait, I'm with
Wendy.
I don't think you get to complain about your food.
Yes, you do.
In jail. I guarantee you, it's better than probably 30% of America is eating tonight. Now, I'm sorry. All right, there's a whole bunch of conditions, but
okay, guys. In the interest of time, let's move on, but we will remind our viewers that Jeff Smith knows a thing or two about these issues. In fact, now he's on the County Justice Services Advisory Board. He's looking at the county jail. He may have opinions on the city jail as well and incarceration in general. We move on to you, Ray Hartmann, because Lieutenant Colonel Troy Doyle has officially sued St. Louis County in court. His attorney is Jerry Dobson. He's going to be on your program tonight. Little program note. And I think Dobson is a great attorney, fine guy. And I don't know Doyle, but I read his tweets. He seems like a great guy. He is alleging that he was not promoted to chief of police in St. Louis County because he is black, and that he was promised the job by St. Louis County executive Sam Page. But then Sam Page said that members of the Police Foundation and Civic Progress didn't want a black guy in that position. Now, I respect the work that Doyle has done, and I think Dobbins is a great guy. But don't you find it a little hard to believe in this day and age that people at these top corporations, when things are so sensitive in so many ways, would really commit what is being alleged here?
If you read the lawsuit and you read the litany, which we're not going to have time to go through, step by step from when, and I don't think that's in dispute, because as you say, it's all allegations, but when Troy Doyle was invited to Sam Page's house and, told that he was the guy and that we needed a black police chief, which I think they do, and that he was going to get him across the finish line all the way through, and you follow the course of the campaign contributions. And there were some little things in there about, again, we'll see if they're true, about Shamed Dogan being, somebody asking if Shamed Dogan's people could raise money. Just the whole litany of things. It really, let's just say I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that lawsuit.
Well, again, these are allegations, right, and it'll be Dobson's responsibility through discovery, whatever, to show through text or recorded messages over the phone or whatever, that the things that are alleged to have said were actually said.
That's all I'm saying, Charlie. We're not in a position to judge it other than having read it.
And Charlie,
be on the receiving end of it.
And you phrased the question as, do you believe that people at the top of these corporations, with everything being so sensitive and on and on? Yes, I do. Because right now, the stupidity train is just, it is off the tracks. It's so wild. No, should they? Okay. Would they? I don't know. But could they? Absolutely. Because that's where we're at right now. It's just unbelievable that any of this is happening. I mean, you're trading emails that are like, so what you going to do about the black guy? Like, what is that? And these are from normally
I don't think that was an email. That was not an email, to the best of my knowledge.
All right.
And what is even more unbelievable to me is that Sam Page he can sort of shapeshift between the board will do what I tell him to do, to, if you believe the lawsuit, well, I'm getting a lot of pushback, and I just don't think this is we're not going to make it across the finish line, or whatever he used. That it almost reads like a telenovela. I mean, it really does.
Well, I'll tell you, as a taxpayer, I don't have much faith in Sam Page or Beth Orwick, the county counselor these days. I'm afraid this is going to be another Wildhaber case where, they're quite convinced they're on good ground, and then there's a multi-million-dollar judgment. So I hope if we have Beth Orwick,
and the Doug Moore text.
She's talking already, I hope, about some kind of settlement.
The Doug Moore text, the former.
Oh, my God. And Doug Moore's an old colleague of mine.
Right.
That whiny email he sent about,
I thought we were friends.
You were my friend, and now you're going to rather make millions of dollars and seek justice.
Well, I
Charlie,
agree. He shouldn't have put it in a text. But what Moore was saying is that he alleged last summer that Doyle threatened to go public unless there was a settlement, and he threatened to go public before the election, or the primary election, where Sam Page was squaring off against Mark Mantovani. So that's Moore's side. But can anyone explain to me, how was it that LJ Punch, African-American representative on the police board, and not someone who is told what to do, as far as I can see, she voted for Mary Barton?
Yeah.
Well, Charlie, it's interesting you bring her up, because we're not jurors, and we would not, at least I certainly couldn't be one impartially. But you asked what I thought, and I know so many people connected, I'd say, that across racial lines that believe that Troy Doyle would have been a dramatically better choice than Mary Barton for whatever. I've just heard it so often. It's kind of hard to go into this and think that Troy Doyle doesn't have a point here. I mean,
well,
it's just
he outranks her. He outranks her. He was invited to Page's house. He was being introduced to the former chiefs of police to talk about how to learn, primers on how to be the chief of the county police department. And then, boom, this is going to be a bad lawsuit for the county. I think Bill's right.
That's what he says, of course. And we'll find out what was said in those meetings with Richard Callow, Sam Page, Tom Irwin, Sam Dotson, and all the others. I guess they'll have a chance to say what was said. And maybe they'll corroborate his findings for sure. Well, I want to ask you folks about the AT&T building, Ray Hartmann. It's on the auction block next month, downtown St. Louis. It was a $204 million building at one point. And then Clayco's Bob Clark, former guest of the show, offered $20 million for it not that long ago. It's going to go on the auction block, this skyscraper, starting at $2.85 million, less than a home in Town and Country. It's a skyscraper in downtown St. Louis on Market Street next to the city garden. What the heck is going on here?
Well, I mean, it's just the legacy of downtown. And this goes back decades, but the powers that be downtown made a decision in the 70s and 80s that they were going to build a lot of buildings like this in the 90s, the gleaming skyscrapers. And I had a front row seat at that in the early days of the Riverfront Times, where they were just dismissive of the value of historic preservation. And I can remember the title guarantee, the Booter and International buildings as an example, and many others that were disregarded because historic preservation wasn't something they wanted to do. And I think this is just sort of a metaphor for what happened to downtown.
They could make it a jail.
We knocked down the historical jail. That's it, right now.
Yeah.
Part of this though is you can't really blame anybody. Like, who knew that we'd have a pandemic and people would work remote and that downtown real estate? I mean, we've made a lot of mistakes. I mean, the third runway at Lambert, where we, tore down a good chunk of Bridgeton for a runway that's been unused, and the downtown that would rival Chicago's. I mean, it's I'm the last person that should weigh in on that subject, so I get it. I mean, I think it's a lot of.
I don't think.
I think the city needs to be wise, or whoever owns it and is selling it, or auctioning it, has to be wise too. If I get it, I think I could do something with it. Like, let's try to bring one specific business in or something like that, and tell me, just don't even have to pay rent. Just bring people.
I think all we couldn't. It's a chicken or the egg situation. You've got this crime problem that has been spiraling out of control downtown, even pre-pandemic. There is nobody to blame. There's nobody to blame. But it all also leads back to the conditions at the city justice center and lock panels that don't work. There's just no money. There's no money.
Well, remember when we tried to give downtown to Jeff Bezos when Amazon was looking for their new headquarters? If only Bezos would have taken downtown.
I'll stick to one point, and that is, I think one of when the history of St. Louis is written, I think one of the things we have done systematically, a lot of systemic problems, is to undervalue historical structures that other communities don't have. That's tough. And
Ray, I agree, but I don't know what was standing there before what they tore down. I just don't know what was there.
Okay.
Very well. Hey, Wendy Wiese, Scott Sifton, a lawmaker in Jeff City, has decided to throw his hat in the ring and take on Roy Blunt, the senior senator from the great state of Missouri, in the next election in the year 2022, right? So what do you think? Can a Democrat take on such a firmly entrenched, long-standing Republican lawmaker like Roy Blunt?
I don't think so. With all due respect to Mr. Sifton, I know he has his fans and certainly seems to be like a very earnest person and with the best of intentions. But I think Roy Blunt's stock right now has never been higher. I think in terms of what we've seen happening within the Republican Party, just the fact that Roy Blunt was one of few grown-ups who basically wasn't engaged in the really dangerous behavior leading up to the insurrection on January 6th. I think he will be very hard to beat. And I think a lot of Democrats will probably vote for him because he was a grown-up.
It's interesting, Wendy, because he is about to vote to acquit Donald Trump. And I happen to like Roy, but I think that it's premature to say what's going to happen. Scott Sifton is a viable candidate. And as recently as 2012, 5 of the 6 statewide seats were held by Democrats. So I know it feels in the age of Trump like there's no chance for a Democrat, but Trump's gone. And I don't know what 2022 is going to look like.
And I'll pick a name out of the air. Suppose Ed Martin beats Roy Blunt in the primary. It puts another dynamic on it. Maybe his biggest problem is the primary, much more than the general. And early Scott Sifton supporter, early, way back.
Alvin, you're right about sports for the American. We have only about 45 seconds to go, but we lost the boxing great, the gold medal winner and the heavyweight boxing champion of the world from the Darce Webby Housing Project, Leon Spinks. Do you think that he ever got his due in his hometown?
Absolutely not. And you pointed it out to me. I did not know. He's not on the Walk of Fame. And he's a former heavyweight champion, defeated Muhammad Ali February 15th, 1978. I watched it all. I went to bed a sick man because I wanted Ali to win the fight. I wanted him to win all his fights. St. Louis never gave him his due. I'm sorry, Ben Hartmann, but he must have been a little young because it didn't happen the way you described it.
Didn't give Chuck Berry his due either.
True that.
I mean, we made a point of the tapes when it came time to erect the statues and that kind of thing, where he was the darling of the global population, but not here in his hometown.
Well, his statue's been in the loop almost 10 years. Went up July 29th, 2011. So we'll have to have a 10-year anniversary for the Chuck Berry statue. But that'll have to wait, because coming up next on Next Up, we talk to Jeff Smith about jails and the homeless and affordable housing. So don't touch that dial.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of 9 PBS.
Well, thanks for joining us for Next Up. 2 of the topics that have been in the news recently, jails and homelessness, and our next guest is an expert on both. Former State Senator Jeff Smith is currently the executive director of the Missouri Workforce Housing Association, trying to find affordable housing for people in Missouri. And he also serves as the board chair of the St. Louis County Justice Services Advisory Board, which is looking into conditions in the county jail. But Mr. Smith also has a connection to Donnybrook, because at one point, some of us were featured in a movie called Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore? And Martin Dugan and Ray, Bill, and we all made cameo appearances in that documentary, which actually is still being used, Jeff, in local classrooms, I am told.
Folks I know who teach political science around the country and who teach in high schools around the country see it as a good learning tool. It's kind of a David versus Goliath story, but it's also a story about how campaigns really work behind the scenes and how grassroots organizing works. So we appreciated all of your insights in the wake of the campaign, Charlie. I think you noted in the film that I knocked on your door. Yes. Is that right?
It is true. You came and campaigned at my house, and I honestly thought that you were a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when you showed up. I thought, here's a young guy from the Mormon Church, and he's going to try and recruit me or tell me the good news. But I will say, and this is just really, really briefly, my son was at an English class, and Dr. Taylor actually presented this film to the class, and he was surprised to find me in it. So that's a small little Brennan family note.
What about
Let's talk about some serious topics, Jeff. Starting with this week, the jail in downtown St. Louis, which is not under your purview, but there was a riot there, and it was the third disturbance in about 6 or so weeks. You're looking into conditions in the county jail right now. One of the issues we're concerned about, we talked about in the first half, is transparency. How do people on the outside actually find out what conditions are like inside an incarceration facility?
That's a great question. Prisons are one of the most opaque institutions in society. A lot of the time, journalists can't even get inside them. And so it's important that people who are there do the best they can when they get out to let people know if there are, conditions that are inhumane. So one of the reasons that the county executive reconstituted the Justice Services Advisory Board about 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, was because there was a rash of deaths in the county jail. And no one really understood why this was happening. I think there were 5 deaths within less than a year. And so one of our purposes as a citizens board is to spend time in the jail, understand what's going on. I was there this weekend. I was there 2 or 3 times in the last week, actually, just talking to residents of the jail, talking to staff, and trying to make sure that we run a facility that is humane and respectful and a place where, hey, no one expects it to be paradise, but it shouldn't be cruel or unusual punishment. And that's what the new director, Doug Burris, is all about. And I think we've seen a real transformation in the conditions there over the last several months.
Well, you're on the advisory board in the county. And first question, and it's kind of just short, the idea of a task force to address what's going on in the city, do you think that's a good idea? And then if you were going to advise them as to how about going about this, what would you tell them, Jeff?
That's a good question, Alvin. First of all, it's absolutely a good idea. I mean, you've had 3 or 4 disturbances in less than 2 months. You've got some problem going on. So yes, I'm glad that the mayor announced that. And I really appreciated the quality of and caliber of the people who were appointed, led by former Supreme Court Justice Mike Wolf. What would I advise them? Well, the first and most obvious thing is the facility has got to be safe. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And I know in the movement to close the workhouse, a lot of people have been funneled towards the City Justice Center, and that may have caused overcrowding in general, but particularly in the middle of a pandemic. When you're going to have people in closed spaces in a pandemic, it means they're probably not going to get near as much time out. They may be in their cell 23, 24 hours a day, and that's no way to live. You have to make sure that you have adequate PPE. There were rumors, and I can't confirm or deny them, but that residents were saying that neither staff nor inmates had adequate protection against COVID, that there was very little testing, that some people were going without food for an extended period of time. So I'm glad there's a task force to look into this. What I learned as a former inmate myself, but also having visited a lot of prisons in the last decade since writing a book on the subject, is that when the residents are treated respectfully, then they treat the staff respectfully. And it's a lot happier environment for everybody, because being in a jail or a prison, it's no fun for anybody, okay? It's not fun for the staff to be in there either. And so when people are treated with compassion and humanity, there's a much better environment for everyone, including the working conditions for staff.
Jeff, I've heard a lot of people are saying just glowing things about Doug Burris. Had him on our show, and he really seems like the real deal. He's only been on the job 4 months. It seems to me there was a point at which your board was not feeling it was involved enough in his selection. Is that fair to say? And now, as of last month, you're still calling for another study of the jail. Why do we need I mean, you've got this obvious blue ribbon board you're on. Why do we need another study?
So any serious problem you have, and I think this isn't just around correctional facilities, but you can't understand how you got there. You can't understand what to do until you understand how you got there. Excuse me. And the problems that culminated in the losses of life in the jail years ago, the personnel issues that we've seen a lot of public back and forth around in the county over the last year or two, those didn't just happen overnight. So we think that there were kind of some deep-seated cultural issues that profoundly affected morale of the staff. And in turn, the staff's very poor morale affected the way that they treated residents. So we think it merits kind of a deeper dive. I agree with you that we're thrilled to have gotten Doug Burris. He retired from his position as the head of the the federal probation office in St. Louis, and people figured that he was kind of done. And then we were able to get him back, and he's done a great job in his first few months. But there were real deeper issues, and they're not fixed at this point, and they're being addressed. But it's not going to be just a gotcha or a backward-looking review. We also want a team that can look at best practices all over the country so that we can have a world-class facility here in St. Louis County that does the best it can do to make sure that the people who are there don't ever come back there after they leave. And part of that means not just being a warehouse, but being a place where you can get some job training, where you can learn, literacy and numeracy skills that have held you back in the job market, where you can get potentially connected to second chance employment when you come home in the way that St. Louis University does through its Second Chance Job Fair. They have a nonprofit inside called the Transformative Workforce Academy that's going to be partnering with the county jail to help people get back on their feet. So there's all kinds of innovative things you can do inside of a jail so that it's not just a warehouse for people, but a way to help lift people up and not ever go back.
Bill?
Jeff, your job is with housing these days. And I got a question for you about housing that always used to come up when I was reporting. And it was the preservationists against the developers on the north side. The preservationists said these brick buildings have to be rehabbed because they're the heart and soul of the city and the neighborhood. And the developers said it's too expensive to try to rehab these old buildings. We need to tear them down and build affordable housing. Where are you on that?
I'm nowhere on that. I'm fascinated by the debate in the same way that you are. But what I'm most concerned with is the production of units, right? I want to see more affordable quality units produced over the next 5 to 10 years. Right now, in the city of St. Louis alone, there's 40,000 people on affordable housing wait lists. There's another 26,000 people on the wait list in St. Louis County. And most wait lists throughout the state, in St. Louis and in Kansas City and other places as well, most of them haven't been open for years. And that means if they were, there would probably be tens of thousands more people. So I love the history of St. Louis. I mean, Charlie, from seeing me at your door, but this is a bold claim, but I may have knocked on as many doors as anybody alive in St. Louis, over 100,000 doors. I love the neighborhoods. I love the historic character of them, and the architectural, heritage of this city is what gives the city the feel that it's got. I'd love to preserve that, but I'm not an absolutist. We can't do that at the cost of producing more units because, there's just too many people in need out there. There's too many people that are half the people in the city are considered rent burdened. That means they spend more than 30% of their income on their housing. A quarter of the people are extremely rent burdened, which means they spend over half of their income on housing. And in a lot of cases, it's really substandard housing. And there are landlords that exploit people, especially vulnerable people, like women coming out of an abusive relationship, people with behavioral health problems, with really bad credit histories or felony convictions on their record, and don't have other alternatives who get exploited by landlords. So we need to increase our stock of quality, safe, affordable housing. And I'm certainly not an absolutist. about whether we do it through preservation or new construction. Appreciate the question, Bill.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff.
Just to revisit when you were responding to Ray's question about the residents at the county jail center, some people call them prisoners. You were also talking about being treated with respect, and Public Safety Director Judge Jimmy Edwards, said of the people who instigated the riot at the City Justice Center that they were seriously defiant, that they were very aggressive, and on and on. Please help us understand the different perspectives on the people who are housed at these facilities. Help us to understand that.
Well, I wasn't at the City Justice Center, and so I don't know exactly what happened. Obviously, there was unrest there. You heard the account afterwards where they said there were locks that don't actually lock, and that inmates had jimmied the locks. So they obviously had a very serious problem with the physical security of the place. As for the term that I used, people who are incarcerated already experience a lot of stigma, and there are certain terms that tend to exacerbate that stigma. And so when possible, I try not to use them. So yeah, I refer to them as residents. The jail is where they live right now. But remember that the vast majority of them have been accused of a crime, but they haven't been to trial yet, and they haven't been convicted of anything. So I try not to add to the stigma that they already will face when they come home.
Jeff, we have some figures about pretrial detention at the county jail, and maybe because of COVID or because the courts aren't working efficiently, or you tell me what's going on here, because we've got one guy who's been there for 5 years. 118 in the county have been there more than 2 years. 190 have been there between 1 and 2 years. This seems to be an exceptionally long period of time for people who haven't been convicted yet. They're just waiting for their day in court.
It's a big problem, and it's something that Director Burris is aware of and has been working really hard to try to address. COVID is responsible for some of it, the disruption and delay in people getting a hearing, but now they've started doing it via Zoom. And so we believe that and a couple other reforms are going to shorten that time, but it's unacceptable for people who are just accused to be sitting in a place for years. In some of those cases, I've looked at a couple of those individual cases where people have been there a very long time. Those tend to be capital cases, which take a longer time to get to trial. But regardless, you have a right to a speedy trial in this country, and it hasn't always happened in St. Louis County, and we're working to change that.
Jeff, going back to the affordable housing, I've asked this question of others too, but all right, when people say affordable housing, it's like, oh, that'd be great or what? But what makes affordable housing affordable? And where does affordable housing go? And okay, so I live in an affordable housing unit, and my rent is whatever it is. If it's it's not a luxury apartment or whatever, but it does cost what it does. Where does the money come from, and where do these go? Is it all like North Side or impoverished areas, or could it be all throughout St. Louis County? So who pays and where are they?
There's a lot of good questions in there, Alvin. What makes something affordable? Well, there's a couple different ways you can measure it. One is based on how much of someone's income they are paying. So something is traditionally considered to be affordable to them, or they're considered burdened by their rent if they're paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. But probably a better analysis is looking at it through the prism of the market. And we like to, from an affordable housing perspective, to make sure that something is affordable, you'd love to see it below market rents for people who cannot afford market rents. One of the mechanisms to do that through a state and federal subsidy is the state low-income housing tax credit program, which matches the federal low-income housing tax credit program, referred to as LIHTC. What that does is basically it gives a tax credit to for-profit or nonprofit developers. There's a lot of both kinds. Gives them tax credits through a very competitive awards process. So they put in an application with the state and they say, we want to put up 50 new units that are affordable, high quality. Maybe McCormick Barron wants to do this, or maybe the Tower Grove, Community Development Corporation. And if they win, and only about 1 out of every 4 or 5 applications receive the award, then they're given tax credits. They sell those tax credits to an investor who knows that he's going, or his organization or her organization will have tax liability over the next decade. And selling those tax credits, converting them to cash, gives you the money to build a quality development. In exchange for those tax credits, you've got to promise you're going to keep the rents well below market rate for the next 30 years. So that's how you ensure affordability. The tax credits take about 15 years to be actually redeemed by the end user of those credits. And during that whole period, the state is coming and ensuring that you are renting only to eligible tenants, that you are keeping the physical plant, well maintained, that you are not a slumlord, and that you aren't flipping those units to a market rate developer, and you're keeping it affordable. So it's a good program. It's got tons of accountability built into it. And, that's why a lot of us fought so hard to bring it back after former Governor Greitens had frozen it.
Jeff, speaking of that issue, one of your roles, as I understand it, at the Missouri Workforce Housing Association is to advocate in Jefferson City. And of course, you were there as a state senator in what feels like a different era. How would you compare the legislature's attitude and how it is to, obviously you have a very different perspective now, on housing issues then and now? How would you compare the legislature?
Another great question. Well, first of all, obviously, I'd rather be making the laws than begging people to tweak the laws just a little bit, pretty please. It was a lot easier before, but the legislature has changed a great deal because of term limits. They take away a lot of institutional memory, and so each 2 years, you're really working to re-educate people on a variety of issues. With the super majorities of Republicans, that can be a challenge, but housing is a bipartisan issue. And one of the cool things about the design of the LIHTC program that we fight for is that instead of the old model from the 1950s, where government built these huge high rises like Pruitt-Igoe, many of which it then had to go and tear down 20 years later because they fell into such disrepair. This new model really relies on the private sector and the philanthropic sector through nonprofits to build and maintain units. And they've tended to do a much better job of keeping units up, keeping buildings leased, and keeping residents satisfied than the previous program, of 50 years ago. So that helps us appeal, not just to people who's, on the liberal side who say, oh, everybody, housing is a human right, but also to people on the right who say, I'm not sure housing is a human right, but I don't want to see a lot of homeless people, and I want a government to do this in the most efficient way possible. So, we try to work, we've successfully built a good bipartisan coalition and negotiated a compromise last year, primarily with State Treasurer Scott Fitzpatrick, who is a big kind of taxpayer advocate. We've got to have maximum efficiency. And he spearheaded some reforms to the program, which I think have really increased the pricing of the credits. Now the credits are selling for as much as 70 cents on the dollar, which is pretty good when you consider the fact that they're not redeemed fully till about 14 or 15 years out, and the time value of money eats away at that dollar a little bit. So, great question,
Bill.
Jeff, what do you think about the tiny house thing? I mean, they've been talking about it for homeless people, these little tiny houses in kind of park-like settings where a number of them would live, and maybe it's only good for single people. I don't know. But what do you think of this tiny house thing?
Well, my perspective is maybe a little interesting since I lived in a 7x8 cell for a year. And now, I've got this house that's like falling in on all sides, and my guest bedroom ceiling is falling in from the master bathroom's shower, which is leaked through the whole place. So I'm not too fond of big houses right now because it's pretty expensive. I think the notion of tiny houses that Jason Kander is is spearheading through this Veterans Community Project, which is building a new development in the Ville for homeless veterans. I think it's a fantastic idea. It's going to be transitional housing. It's not for them to live the rest of their life, but it's a place to get well, you know, to heal from PTSD or substance use disorder or any other, you know, number of ailments that people are struggling with. Get them case management, get them treatment, get them job skills connected to employers. I love the concept that Jason is bringing to St. Louis from Kansas City. And, you know, I think he's bringing it all over the country. And so I'm a fan of it. And I hope that it doesn't get lost in the mayoral transition.
Thank you.
A housing departure question, Jeff, in terms of politics, we have to ask you this because Senator Hawley is your contemporary. When the dust settles, and I'm sure you've had conversations with other political insiders, what do you think the future holds for Senator Hawley and the Republican Party?
Well, I think that, you know, Warren Buffett once said of the stock market, in the short term, it's a popularity contest, but in the long term, it's a scale. I think if you look at the way Republicans are in the U.S. Senate and House right now are looking at President Trump, in the short term, they may win the popularity contest in a Republican primary to stick with him. In the long term, in the great broad sweep of history, I think they're going to be embarrassed, and their children and grandchildren will not be happy with the vote that I think most of the Republicans in the Senate are going to take on impeachment. So, you know, I think Josh Hawley is probably never going to be beat in a U.S. Senate primary in Missouri. Certainly, he thinks this will endear him to Trump world. But I think we saw with Vice President Pence that you can be loyal for 4 years, do everything for Donald Trump. And then if you won't go and do the absolute ultimate thing, that last mile, he'll cut you off this quick. He will ignore frantic calls from other Republicans, you know, for hours while Mike Pence's life is being threatened by, you know, violent rioters. So we'll see if this really ends up endearing him to the Trump base. You know, given his history, given his pedigree, given his manner of speech, I think maybe he knows the words to the Trump song, but I don't think he really has the rhythm. And so I don't think he's going to end up being the nominee. But, you know, I don't think he'll lose his Senate seat over this. I don't think it's affected him that bad.
Jeff, we have less than 2 minutes to go here. If you could, there was a decision out of Boise this week that they are not going to challenge a lawsuit that said basically if they take homeless off the streets, they have to provide housing for them. Boise has decided that it's going to provide housing now for the homeless there. You remember they took this case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which said cities and towns, if you take homeless off the streets, you have to have some place for that person to live. And I think what's happening now is you're finding a lot of homeless on sidewalks, and there's nothing municipalities can legally do anymore because the Supreme Court decided not to take this issue. So in Los Angeles and San Francisco and on Clark Street in downtown St. Louis, you're seeing little encampments now that you didn't have for years. What should be done about the homeless in American cities?
So a lot of people that have that suffer from homelessness are suffering from other issues too. Many have, you know, one of the highest proportions of people who are homeless have some type of criminal background, some type of conviction. That tends to make it very difficult for them to find landlords who will rent to them. Once you are homeless, then a lot of people develop or have substance use disorders that are exacerbated. So you really need like wraparound services. You need people to care for folks and have some type of care coordination. We've had to start with that in St. Louis with the continuum of care, but it's not all the way where it needs to be. And we still don't have enough beds in shelters every night to get people there. I think there's about 500 shelter beds on any given night in St. Louis and about 1,500 people that are homeless. We need the whole region to chip in. People who are homeless in St. Louis County, St. Charles County, Franklin, Jefferson, they gravitate towards the city because that's where services are. But those other counties need to step up and fund the type of coordinated care that we need to
Jeff,
get.
we're going to have to thank you for your time and cut you off there. But with this interruption, how about you join us again sometime for another Donnybrook Next Up?
I would love that. I really appreciate everybody's questions. Good to see all of you.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of 9PBS.